Before you get into the field to collect data, do a test run of your sampling methodology. Whether you're laying out transects and collecting data in quadrats in a field or counting organisms underwater, do a test run of your methodology before you start data collection in earnest. Try out your methodology, see what works and what doesn't, and adjust accordingly. Testing things before you go will allow you to think about how you will organize your data collection. You can figure out the best and most convenient way to set up your field notebook or other note-taking device to make it easier for you to fill in the details when you start your research. These steps will help you to be as prepared as possible when you finally get into the field.
When you plan to visit the sample site yourself, you might arrive and find out that there is something about the geography or reachability that you didn't know. It's hard to take dry soil samples of a polder in the Netherlands when it's flooded. Your pristine grassland in the Alps might be on top of a mountain, and your sample tools need to be carried up there. And public transport timetables are not very reliable in some parts of the world. All of this is especially important if you only have a short time window for your fieldwork, so plan ahead.
Another important consideration before starting fieldwork is to make sure that you have the required permissions for the data collection you plan to undertake. Depending on the country, state, or region where you work, you may need different permissions. If you will work in a national park or other protected area, you will need permissions to ensure that your work is carried out in accordance with the rules and regulations governing such areas. If you plan to collect any live organisms or biological materials, you will likely need special permits. The same is true if you plan to move any samples across country borders. For fieldwork with live animals and human subjects, you must obtain ethical approval and ensure that your work takes special ethical considerations to reduce harm. If you're conducting fieldwork outside of your home country, having the necessary permissions shows respect for your host region and helps to avoid any possible setbacks. By ensuring you have all required permissions to conduct your work, you will minimize mishaps and lay a legal foundation for your work so that you can carry on with your research without avoidable disruptions.
If you want to do field data collection, you really have to respect Murphy's Law, which means what can go wrong will go wrong. For my bachelor's thesis, I wanted to collect data on a certain insect species in Tanzania, but when I arrived there, I found out that the insect species was nowhere to be found. I had no other choice but to switch to a different research question, and luckily there was a local professor who had some projects lying around, and in the end I managed to collect some valuable data in Tanzania. But it really doesn't hurt to have a plan B, and you really should expect the unexpected when doing fieldwork.
Fieldwork doesn't have to be expensive. If your lab or research project has tons of funding and you have access to the newest toys and gadgets, great. However, that's not the reality for many, and that's okay. You do not need the newest or most high-tech equipment to conduct quality fieldwork and collect great data. Most of the world's biggest ecological discoveries were made in good old-fashioned notebooks full of someone's almost illegible scribbles. A quality field notebook or even a paper on a clipboard and a pencil are a researcher's greatest tools. If you prefer to collect data on a device like a cell phone, tablet, or computer, there are plenty of free software alternatives to expensive programs. It might just take a little digging. There are many free apps available that can transform your everyday phone into a research instrument. Fieldwork does not have to cost a fortune.
It's always a good idea to label your field samples correctly and to do it more than one time. On a trip in Poland, I labeled vials containing insects by putting a piece of paper inside of the vial. Unfortunately, those samples weren't constantly cooled and the labels began to rot together with the insects. Luckily, we had also marked the vials themselves with a marker, but some of these markings became unreadable due to wear and tear during transport. Luckily, the fact that we had a double labeling system made sure that there was always something readable.
When starting your fieldwork, it's a good idea to collect more variables than you think you might need. Variables like temperature, soil, or sediment type, rainfall, geographic coordinates, or other organisms that come wandering through your study site are good to include, even if they don't seem immediately relevant. Remember, this is fieldwork, not a controlled experiment, so there will be many variables outside of your control that may be influencing the outcomes you are trying to measure. Write down your observations each day on the conditions around your study site. You never know when you might need those data later, and it's better to have collected them from the beginning of the work than to have to go back and resample later. Think of it like an insurance policy for your research. Plus, you might end up with extra data for another interesting paper in the future.
Writing down data in the field is a messy affair. It often has to be done quickly and sometimes in harsh weather conditions. When you're in the process of sampling, it all makes sense to you. You don't have any doubt that you remember how the notes are supposed to be interpreted. But then when you finally want to convert them to an Excel table, you'll find out that you can't make sense of it anymore. It really is best to do this job the day you recorded your data. And of course, don't forget to make a backup of that Excel sheet.